The night had settled over Millstone like a tired sigh. Streetlights flickered to life along Main Street, casting pools of amber across cracked sidewalks that had seen better decades. A few neon signs hummed in storefronts, the pharmacy, a laundromat, and at the edge of town Brewer's Bar, where a faded wooden sign swung gently in the autumn breeze. Luke Walker pulled his weathered pickup into the gravel lot, the engine coughing before settling into silence. The truck had seen 200,000 miles and counting, but under his hands it still ran like it had something to prove. His fingers lingered on the steering wheel, calloused palms feeling every imperfection in the worn leather. The hands of a man who fixed things for a living, and sometimes broke them when necessary. He glanced at the rear-view mirror, gray eyes meeting his own reflection. 40 years had etched lines around them, deepened the furrow between his brows. His hair, once military short, now hung past his collar streaked with premature silver at the temples. Not vanity, just the absence of reason to cut it since he'd left service 8 years ago. Those eyes shifted to the passenger seat where his 12-year-old son Caleb sat hunched over a tablet, fingers dancing across the screen with practiced precision. The boy's face glowed blue in the electronic light, highlighting cheekbones that were beginning to lose their childhood softness. "Something's troubling you." Luke didn't need to voice it. The tightness in his son's shoulders spoke volumes. The way Caleb's left thumb tapped rapidly against the screen, a nervous tick he'd had since he was 5. 8 years of it, being just the two of them, had made words sometimes unnecessary. Caleb looked up the screen's glow, making his eyes seem older than his years. "Just hungry, Dad." 3 words, but with the even cadence that meant more was being held back. Luke nodded once. The conversation wasn't over, just postponed, another dance in their carefully choreographed relationship. They stepped out of the truck, boots crunching on gravel. Luke's hand automatically reached for his son's shoulder, not to guide, but to connect. Caleb didn't pull away. Small victories. The neon Brewers sign hummed above them, casting their faces in alternating red and blue shadows as they approached the wooden door. Luke paused before entering Old Habits Dying Hard. Scanning the parking lot, 3 motorcycles, 5 cars, a modest Tuesday night crowd. His body remembered battlefield assessments, exits, angles, sightlines. His mind told him this was just a small-town bar where no one knew their names. But his instincts, those never fully retired. The warmth hit them first as they pushed through the heavy door, then the smell, fried food spilled beer pine cleaner. A jukebox in the corner played something country and melancholic. The bar itself stretched along the far wall, polished wood gleaming under hanging lamps. 6 patrons hunched over drinks, 2 booths occupied. A pool table stood empty under its dedicated light. Walter the bartender looked up from wiping glasses, mid-60s, barrel-chested, with a salt and pepper beard that couldn't hide the scar running from his right ear to his chin. His eyes narrowed slightly, professional wariness at newcomers, then softened at the sight of Caleb. "We serve food to minors till 9, he called out, nodding toward an empty booth in the corner. Something in the way he stood, shoulders square, weight evenly distributed, marked him as former military. Luke recognized the posture like looking in a mirror from another decade. "Thanks. Just passing through." Luke's voice was low, the words economical. He guided Caleb toward the booth, choosing the seat facing the door. "Old habits. Always face the entrance. Always know who's coming." Caleb slid into the seat opposite, immediately reaching for a laminated menu wedged between the ketchup bottle and the napkin dispenser. His eyes scanned it methodically, but Luke noticed how they occasionally darted around the room, taking inventory just as he had done. The boy had never been taught to do that. He'd simply absorbed it the way children inherit more than just genetics. Walter appeared with 2 waters moving, with the efficient grace of a man comfortable in his space. "Nothing fancy here, but the burgers are honest, and the fries don't come frozen." Luke nodded appreciation for the straightforward assessment. 2 burgers medium, fries. He hesitated, then added, "And coffee black." Walter's eyes lingered on Luke a moment longer than necessary, recognition not of the face but of the type. He'd seen men like this before, men who carried themselves like they were still wearing body armor, even in civilian clothes. Men whose eyes checked exits before menus. "Coming right up." Walter retreated to the kitchen, pushing through a swinging door. Luke's attention shifted to the far corner of the bar, where 2 women sat in a booth, both nursing what looked like whiskey's neat. Identical faces, different styles. Twins. They stood out in millstone like orchids in a cornfield. Designer clothes, perfect posture, the confident poise of people accustomed to being noticed, but not approached. The one facing Luke had hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, her expression calculating distant. Her sister wore her hair down, her features softer but still alert. But it wasn't the women who held Luke's attention. It was the two men at the counter who kept glancing their way. Rick Mason leaned against the bar, a toothpick dancing between his lips as he whispered something to his companion. Mid-30s, muscular build beneath a tight black t-shirt with the hyper-awareness of someone who'd seen combat but hadn't processed it properly. His arms bore faded tattoos, military insignia partially covered by newer, darker ink. His eyes never settled, constantly scanning, predatory rather than cautious. Beside him, Kyle fidgeted on his stool, younger by at least a decade, with the eager nervousness of a man desperate to prove himself. His hand kept drifting to his waistband, where the outline of something, not a phone, pressed against his shirt. Luke recognized the dynamic immediately. The veteran and his protege, the seasoned predator and his hungry understudy. A dangerous combination, especially with alcohol involved. He'd seen it in bases across 3 continents. The energy was unmistakable. Caleb followed his father's gaze, absorbing the tableau with eyes too perceptive for 12. "The women don't want company," he observed quietly, his voice neutral, but his assessment precise. Luke nodded slightly. "Eat your dinner when it comes, not our business." But his body had already shifted, muscles tensing imperceptibly. The air in the bar seemed to change density the way it does before a storm. Something about the way Rick kept looking at the women. Something about the way Kyle's hand couldn't stay still. Warning signs as clear as flares to a man who'd spent years reading them. Walter returned with their food plates clacking against the worn wooden table. He followed Luke's gaze toward the bar, his expression darkening. "Enjoy the meal," he muttered, but his eyes said something else entirely. "Watch yourself. The regulars aren't always regular." The burgers were indeed honest. Thick hand-formed patties on toasted buns that hadn't come from a package. The fries were cut thick, skins still on. Simple food made with care. Luke ate mechanically, body requiring fuel while his attention remained divided. Caleb mirrored his father's efficiency, though his eyes occasionally flickered to the tablet in his backpack, as if the digital world pulled at him even now. At the bar, Rick finished his drink, sliding the empty glass forward with 2 fingers. "Another," he demanded, voice carrying across the room. "Make it a double." His eyes never left the women's booth. The twin with the ponytail, Dominique, sensed his stare. Her posture stiffened further, if that was possible. Her sister, Danielle, leaned forward, whispered something that made Dominique shake her head almost imperceptibly. A private negotiation. Luke took another bite of his burger, watching as Walter reluctantly poured Rick's drink. The bartender's movements had become deliberate, cautious. The room's energy had shifted like a weather vane in changing winds. Kyle knocked back his own drink, liquid courage that straightened his spine. He nudged Rick, muttering something that made the older man chuckle darkly. Then they both stood, drinks in hand, and made their way toward the women's booth. "Ladies," Rick's voice carried a false warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "2 beautiful women all alone in our little town. 3rd night this week. Must be looking for company." The woman facing him, Dominique, didn't blink. "Just a drink." "That all right with you?" Something in her voice, the crisp precision of her words, the subtle authority, suggested she wasn't accustomed to being questioned. Her accent was Eastern, seaboard educated, wealthy, out of place in Millstone as diamonds in a coal mine. Rick leaned closer, toothpick shifting to the corner of his mouth like a sneer. "Depends on why you're really here," flashing those fancy badges again. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Luke's hand paused halfway to his coffee cup. Badges. Federal most likely, though, not local law enforcement. The women's body language wasn't police, it was something else. Something that required more training, more discipline. Danielle smiled thinly, but her eyes remained cold. "We're having a private conversation. Maybe you could respect that." Kyle moved closer, emboldened by the alcohol burning in his veins and the need to impress his mentor. His hand drifted again to his waistband, this time with purpose. "You know what I think? I think you're not who you say you are, and I think that's a problem." Luke set down his burger, wiping his hands deliberately on a napkin. Dad Caleb's voice was quiet questioning. Stay put. Luke's words were fun, but carried the weight of command. The kind that had once directed men through firefights and ambushes. The kind that brooked no argument. Rick placed his hands on the table, leaning into the women's space alcohol fumes preceding his words. So what's it gonna be? You gonna tell us what brings you to our dusty little town? Or do we need to get more persuasive? Dominique didn't lean back, didn't flinch. She simply looked at him with eyes that had seen worse threats from more dangerous men. I think you should walk away now, while you still can. Luke stood, his movement so fluid it seemed that almost casual. But Caleb recognized it. The way his father's center of gravity shifted, the way his hands hung loose at his sides. Ready. The boy's heart rate accelerated, not from fear, but from anticipation. He'd seen this before. That's enough. Luke's voice cut through the tension, low but clear. Not loud, not threatening, just firm. The voice of someone stating a fact rather than making a request. The room went silent. Walter froze behind the bar cloth suspended over a half-dried glass. The few other patrons stopped mid-conversation, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the way animals sense an earthquake before it registers on instruments. Rick turned slowly, toothpick clenched between his teeth. His eyes narrowed as they took in Luke. The stance, the calm focus, the absolute lack of fear. Who the hell are you? Luke didn't answer. Didn't need to. His presence was answer enough. A man who had no desire for confrontation but no fear of it either. Kyle's hand moved decisively now, reaching under his jacket. The motion was practiced, familiar, the draw of a concealed weapon. But before his fingers could close around the grip, before he could clear leather, Luke moved. One step forward, closing distance. His right hand caught Kyle's wrist in mid-draw, twisting upward with precise pressure on tendons that instantly numbed the younger man's fingers. With his left hand, Luke pivoted the weapon away and clear, a 9mm with the serial number filed off. His knee dropped slightly, center of gravity lowering, as he used Kyle's own momentum to redirect him, sending him sprawling across the bar counter in a cascade of upended glasses. Rick lunged, face contorted with rage and surprise. His technique was military. Efficient, direct, lethal if landed. But Luke sidestepped with the economy of movement that comes from training beyond mere combat, the kind that treats violence as physics rather than emotion. Rick's punch found empty air. His forward momentum carried him into Luke's carefully positioned foot, tripping him into a bar stool that clattered to the floor along with its occupant. The entire sequence took less than 4 seconds. The room froze in tableau. Kyle face down on the bar counter, guns skittering across the floor. Rick sprawled among overturned stools. Luke standing calmly, hands already returned to a neutral position, not even breathing hard. It was then that something small and metallic rolled across the floor. A steel ball bearing that struck Rick's ankle just as he attempted to rise, causing his foot to slip on the beer-slicked floor. He fell again, face first, with a crack that suggested his nose had found the hardwood. Luke's eyes darted to Caleb, who sat innocently in their booth, hands visible on the table. But the slight bulge in his right cheek suggested he had been holding the bearing in his mouth ready. Their eyes met, father and son, in a moment of silent communication that needed no words, an understanding that transcended conventional parenting. Now the twin named Dominique stood, reaching deliberately into her jacket pocket. Her movements were slow, careful, telegraphed to avoid misinterpretation. She withdrew a small leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a silver badge that caught the bar's dim light. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words hung in the air, crystal clear, despite her measured tone. My sister and I would appreciate it if everyone remained calm. Gasps echoed through the room. The few remaining patrons pressed themselves against walls and into corners, suddenly eager to become background characters in whatever scene was unfolding. Rick, still on the floor, spat blood and snarled, "That's fake. Impersonating federal officers is a felony." His eyes, now swimming with hate, locked onto Luke. "And you just assaulted law enforcement." Danielle stepped forward, her previously friendly demeanor hardened into professional authority. "I suggest you shut up before you dig your own grave deeper, Officer Mason." Rick struggled to his feet, wobbling slightly. He pulled out his phone with bloody fingers. "We'll see what the sheriff thinks when he gets here." The air in the bar grew heavy, charged with implication. Luke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The trap had sprung, too neatly, too perfectly. This had been choreographed from the moment he and Caleb walked through the door. Danielle moved closer to Luke, her voice dropping to something between warning and regret. You shouldn't have helped us. Luke's expression didn't change. You needed it. Dominique approached, studying him with clinical precision. Her eyes cataloged his stance, his response time, the way he'd neutralized two threats without excessive force or hesitation. You just made yourself a target. From behind Luke came Caleb's voice, steady and matter-of-fact. Then we aim better. The bar watched in stunned silence as the man, the boy, and the two mysterious women stood together amid overturned furniture and spilled drinks. And outside, distant sirens began to wail, growing louder with each passing second. The sirens crescendoed their Doppler whine, cutting through the night air like searchlights through fog. Red and blue strobe effects danced across the window blinds, casting the interior of Brewer's Bar in alternating crimson and cobalt shadows. The effect transformed familiar faces into something alien, highlighting sweat on foreheads, blood on knuckles, fear in eyes. Inside the bar, no one moved. The tableau held, Luke standing with military stillness between the twin women and the two men he'd neutralized. His breathing remained even controlled. This wasn't adrenaline. It was muscle memory, the body's recollection of countless similar moments, when stillness meant survival. Caleb stood behind his father, red hoodie pulled up despite the warmth of the room. His eyes darted between Kyle, still nursing his dislocated wrist, and the door where shadows now gathered. The boy's hands had disappeared into his pockets, but the slight bulge in his right cheek suggested he still had more steel bearings ready, small, deadly, accurate when thrown by practiced fingers. Danielle's voice cut through the silence, precise as a surgeon's blade. Backup's going to storm in blind. They'll see 3 cops down and a man with a military build standing over them. Luke didn't move, didn't even blink. Let them come. Dominique pulled a phone from her jacket and tapped the screen twice with manicured nails. They won't ask questions. Mason's in deep with the sheriff. This is a setup, I figured. Luke's reply was flat, emotionless, as if sprung traps were simply Tuesday's inconvenience, like rain on laundry day. You don't sound surprised. Danielle studied his posture, the way his weight was distributed evenly, ready to move in any direction. I've seen this playbook before. Different uniforms, same stink. Outside gravel crackled under heavy tires. Flashing lights intensified, painting the room in emergency colors. Someone yelled over a bullhorn, unintelligible words with unmistakable authority. A door slammed, then the sound of multiple boots on pavement. 12, maybe 15 pairs, Luke estimated automatically, the way he'd once counted incoming footsteps in darkened compounds half a world away. He exhaled slowly like a diver preparing for a long descent. Caleb, he said without turning. You remember the plan? The boy nodded. Stick to shadows. Watch everything. Intervene only if it gets stupid. That's my boy. Luke's voice carried more than approval. It carried absolute trust. Faith in his son's judgment beyond what most parents would grant a child his age. Caleb stepped back into the dim hallway near the restrooms, melting into the shadows, with such natural ease that no one saw him go. It wasn't learned behavior. It was inherited instinct passed down like eye color or the shape of his hands. The front door burst open, hinges protesting with a screech that matched the final wail of the sirens outside. Sheriff Morton was first through, large-bellied and red-faced, holding a shotgun, with the casual familiarity of someone who considered weapons extensions of himself rather than tools to be respected. Behind him came a squad of deputies, weapons drawn, eyes wide with a combination of fear and excitement that made them more dangerous than if they'd been merely aggressive. Untrained adrenaline looking for outlet. What the hell happened here? Morton barked, a shotgun sweeping the room in an arc that violated basic firearm safety. His jowls quivered with each syllable, face flushed with something beyond exertion. Anticipation, perhaps. Or satisfaction at a plan unfolding. Before Luke could speak, Rick staggered forward, blood from his nose painting his upper lip crimson. He attacked us. His words were thick, nasalized. Broke Kyle's wrist and assaulted 3 officers. And these 2, he jabbed a finger toward the twins. They're pretending to be FBI. Morton turned to Luke, eyes narrowing beneath bushy brows. You got 10 seconds to get on the ground before I put you there myself." Luke didn't move, didn't tense, didn't give any indication that he'd heard the threat at all. Instead, with perfect calm, asked to see the badge. They forged it. Rick shouted spittle and blood spraying with his vehemence. "It's fake. I know federal when I see it." Dominique stepped forward, lifting her FBI ID slowly with 2 fingers, as one might handle a cobra. "Special Agent Dominique Hart, serial number 209, Bravo, Washington Field Office. You can call Assistant Director Ellison for verification, but I suggest you use a secure line." Morton ignored her eyes, never leaving Luke. "Cuff them all now." 2 deputies moved toward Luke, hands reaching for zip ties attached to their belts. Then everything happened at once. Kyle, still reeling from his injured wrist, pointed with his good hand. "He's dangerous. He disarmed me." Morton raised the shotgun higher. Luke's stance shifted. A fraction of an inch adjustment in his left foot, a subtle bend in his right knee. Nearly imperceptible, but to trained eyes it was the coiling of a spring. And then Kyle lunged again, his pride too wounded to stay still. Luke moved like water, fluid, adaptable, finding the path of least resistance. He caught Kyle's elbow mid-strike, using the younger man's own momentum against him, redirecting it with precision, born of thousands of repetitions in training rooms across 3 continents. Kyle stumbled forward directly into the sheriff's substantial chest. Morton staggered backward, his shotgun swinging upward with the movement. In the same heartbeat, Luke ducked, caught the weapon with one hand, and twisted it sideways as it discharged, sending the shell harmlessly into the wooden beam above the bar in a shower of splinters and dust. The room exploded into chaos. Dominique swept Danielle behind her with practiced efficiency, both taking cover behind an overturned table. The deputies froze suddenly, unsure who to aim at or what orders to follow. "Stand down," Danielle shouted above the commotion. "We're federal agents, lie." Rick shouted back, his earlier confidence returning now that numbers favored him. "They're all part of it. He's protecting them." Luke didn't speak. Instead, he placed the shotgun on the ground slowly and raised his hands. One message, no threat, no fear. "I didn't come to fight," he said clearly. "But I won't let corruption wear a badge and call itself justice." There was silence, heavy, expectant, like the moment between lightning and thunder. And then Walter, who had been hiding behind the counter, stood up slowly and shouted, "He saved those women. I saw it. The kid, too. One of the cleanest takedowns I've ever seen. And I served 2 tours in Fallujah." Morton's lips twitched, the only indication that his script wasn't being followed. Dominique stood upright now, her badge raised high like a talisman. "You can detain us, but it'll be the last thing you do before this county gets buried under federal charges." Luke turned to her, eyes knowing. They're not listening. This isn't about justice. It's about covering tracks. Rick, now holding his side where he'd landed on a bar stool, smiled wickedly. "Doesn't matter. We'll book you anyway. Charge you with obstruction, impersonation, assault. You name it. That's if you can find a judge who isn't on your payroll," Danielle added coldly. Morton gestured toward Luke with a meaty hand. "Cuff him." 2 deputies finally approached, this time with more caution, as if handling an unexploded ordnance. Luke didn't resist. He extended his arms calmly, wrist forward. "Do what you came to do." His voice carried neither defeat nor defiance, just calm acceptance of a battle temporarily postponed. As the cold metal clicked shut around his wrists, Caleb watched from the shadows, eyes narrowed, hands gripping a small handheld device that glowed faintly in the darkness. From his angle, he had seen something the others hadn't. A thin black wire taped under the bar counter connected to a small red LED that blinked in steady rhythm. A live audio feed recording everything. He tapped a command on his device and whispered to himself. They rigged the bar. A deputy dragged Luke past the window toward a waiting cruiser. Morton shoved Dominique and Danielle toward a second vehicle, hands unnecessarily rough on their shoulders. The bar emptied as patrons were herded outside for questioning, and the silence returned like a breath being held by the entire town. Inside, Caleb sat alone in the darkened booth, the glow of his laptop illuminating his young face with ethereal blue light. He whispered to himself, fingers dancing across the keyboard with purpose. They messed with the wrong veteran and the wrong kid. The cold steel of the handcuffs didn't bother Luke. He'd worn worse. Shackles in foreign detention centers, zip ties behind enemy lines, ropes soaked in seawater during SEER training. This was just theater of performance for the benefit of men who wore law like a costume they changed depending on the day's role. The back of the police cruiser smelled like old sweat synthetic leather and something that had once been coffee before evaporating into the upholstery. Luke sat with military stillness, spine straight, despite the uncomfortable angle forced by his restrained hands, eyes fixed on the metal mesh between him and the two officers in front. Rick Mason drove one hand on the wheel, the other holding a blood-stained napkin to his nose. Kyle nursed his wrist in the passenger seat, silence broken only by occasional winces when they hit potholes in the county road. Hell of a mess you caused back there. Rick's voice was nasal, congested from the blood still trickling from his nostrils. The toothpick had disappeared, likely lost in the scuffle. You could have just kept your head down, old man. Could have finished your burger, walked out, and nobody would have remembered your face. Luke shifted slightly, just enough to lean toward the barrier. You don't forget the face of a man abusing power, he said, voice low but clear. It stays with you, years later in the mirror, in your sleep. Rick didn't respond immediately, but his jaw tightened visibly, the muscles working beneath his stubbled skin. The cruiser took a sharp right, cutting off the main road and heading down a stretch of cracked asphalt flanked by dead fields and rusted fences that hadn't contained livestock in decades. Luke frowned, mental map recalibrating. This isn't the station. New holding site, Rick said, the smirk evident in his voice even from behind. No paperwork. The implication hung in the recycled air of the cruiser. No paperwork meant no record, no processing, no phone call, just a man disappearing into the administrative cracks of a system designed with such cracks intentionally built in. Rick's eyes met Luke's in the rearview mirror. Paperwork comes later, after. Luke leaned back against the seat posture, relaxing not from relief, but from acceptance. So it was a ghost route, the kind of detour that existed in every law enforcement jurisdiction, whether acknowledged or not. The places where suspects developed injuries that weren't recorded, where confessions were obtained without Miranda warnings, where people could vanish temporarily or permanently, depending on how stubbornly they clung to inconvenient truths. They didn't know who he was. That was their first mistake. The cruiser bumped along an increasingly rural route, streetlights giving way to darkness, broken only by the headlights and the occasional dilapidated farmhouse set back from the road. They passed an abandoned gas station windows, boarded ancient pumps standing like tombstones to a bygone era. Then a shuttered grain elevator, its metal skeleton silhouetted against the night sky. Finally, they turned onto a dirt track barely wide enough, for the vehicle branches scraping against the sides like fingernails on metal. The headlights illuminated a small clearing where a concrete structure squatted, a former storage facility for county road equipment, according to the faded signs still hanging askew from one rusted hinge. The cruiser rolled to a stop, dust billowing around the headlights in a golden haze. Rick cut the engine but left the lights on, bathing the building's entrance in harsh illumination that created deep shadows on either side. End of the line, Walker. Rick's voice had regained its confidence now that they'd reached familiar territory. He turned in his seat, eyeing Luke with a mixture of triumph and lingering anger. You're the first visitor we've had in a while who came with his own kid. Shame he had to see his daddy taken down like that. Luke's expression remained neutral, but something shifted behind his eyes. A dangerous calculation, cold and precise. Leave my son out of your mouth. Rick laughed, the sound sharp and without humor. Touched a nerve, did I? Don't worry, once we're done with you, we'll make sure he's taken care of. Foster system in this county is, let's say, understanding of our needs. Kyle opened his door, wincing as he jarred his injured wrist. Shut up and let's get him inside. I need some painkillers. The two officers exited the vehicle, Kyle circling to open Luke's door. The night air was cold, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and distant wood smoke. Kyle grabbed Luke's arm, yanking him from the back seat with unnecessary force. Luke allowed himself to be manhandled, body loose, offering no resistance that might justify escalation. Inside, the storage facility had been converted for its new purpose. The main room was bare except for a metal table bolted to the concrete floor, 3 folding chairs, and a single flickering fluorescent light that buzzed intermittently overhead. A smaller room off to the side had been fitted with a steel door, a makeshift cell with no windows, and a drain in the center of the floor. The implications of that drain weren't lost on Luke. 2 more deputies lounged near a space heater in the corner, playing cards spread on an upturned crate between them. They looked up as Rick entered, followed by Kyle and their handcuffed prisoner. Got a live one, Rick announced, shoving Luke forward. Thinks he's some kind of hero, protector of fake feds and defender of the innocent. One of the deputies stood a heavy-set man with thinning hair and the permanent flush of a drinker. He looked Luke over with bored eyes. Another drifter, thinking he can clean up Millstone. Not a drifter. Rick circled Luke like a wolf assessing prey. Military, I'm guessing. The way he moved. Special forces, maybe. Think you're still wearing a flag, soldier boy? Luke remained silent, eyes scanning the room. Exits, weapons, distances. 4 men varying degrees of training. 1 injured. 2 likely slow due to weight and age. All armed. The odds weren't favorable, but he'd faced worse with fewer advantages. The second deputy, younger and leaner than his partner, shuffled the cards nervously. Sheriff said to wait for his call before processing this one. Rick snorted, pulling a flask from his jacket pocket and taking a long swig. Since when do we wait for Morton to wipe his own ass? The man's busy with the feds. He tapped his nose gingerly. Besides, our friend here broke my nose. I think that earns him some personal attention. He stepped closer to Luke, alcohol fumes preceding his words. You picked the wrong town to play hero and Walker. This isn't Baghdad. This isn't whatever shithole you patrolled with your government badge. This is my town. And in my town, people like you take the fall. Luke raised an eyebrow slightly. People like me. Rick's face darkened. Military boys who think the rules don't apply because they served. Men who can't accept that their time has passed. The world doesn't need your kind of hero anymore, Walker. It needs people who understand how the system really works. You think those 2 fake FBI girls are going to save you? Rick continued, voice rising. You think your little sidekick of a son is going to expose a system that's been running this county for a decade? He stepped even closer, close enough that Luke could count the burst capillaries in the man's nose. Smell the sour combination of whiskey and blood on his breath. Let me tell you what's going to happen. By morning, you'll be officially booked for assaulting 3 officers. Those women impersonating federal agents. That's 10 years minimum. And your Sunwell Children's Services in this county works very closely with the sheriff's department. Luke met his eyes calmly. You done? Rick scoffed. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Luke said quietly, you've talked too much for someone who thinks he's in control. Rick froze, then laughed, a sharp bark that bounced off the concrete walls. You got nothing. You're in cuffs in the middle of nowhere with 4 armed officers. What exactly do you think you have? I've got something you don't, Luke replied, voice steady. A son with a spine and a skill set you can't spell. That one landed. Rick's smirk faded, replaced by something harder. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the first inklings of doubt in a plan he'd thought bulletproof. Luke leaned back, wrists still cuffed behind him. By now, he's got your wire loop decrypted, your call logs tracked, and your financials flagged. You're not just losing a cover-up, Mason. You're losing your kingdom. Rick's fist clenched, knuckles whitening. His body tensed, the desire to strike, warring with the small voice of caution that had just begun to whisper in his ear. You think the feds will listen to some brat with a laptop? They'll listen to the evidence, Luke said. They always do. Eventually. Back at the motel room Luke had rented on the edge of town, Caleb Walker sat cross-legged on the bed, his fingers flying across 3 devices laid out before him like a command center. The main laptop displayed a map of Millstone County with a blinking red dot moving along a back road. A second smaller tablet showed lines of code scrolling at a rate too fast for most adults to process. A third device, a modified smartphone, was connected to a small black box that silently intercepted radio frequencies from the local sheriff's department. The boy didn't look frightened, though his father had just been taken away in handcuffs. He didn't look panicked, though he was alone in a strange town surrounded by hostile forces. Instead, his young face bore the focused concentration of someone executing a long-practiced plan, a contingency his father had prepared him for since he was old enough to understand that the world wasn't always fair and that systems meant to protect often did the opposite. Caleb rewound the footage he'd extracted from Brewer's Bar's security system, analyzing it frame by frame on his main screen. The audio feed he'd detected under the bar counter had been easy enough to hack. A simple wireless transmitter operating on a frequency used by baby monitors and cheap surveillance equipment. Amateur hour, as his father would say. The video told the story clearly. Rick and Kyle had surrounded the Hart twins before the first confrontation. Nothing physical, but the body language was predatory, intimidating. Caleb tracked the positions of both men in separate windows, assigning color-coded overlays to their movement patterns. There it was. He paused on a frame where Rick leaned on the counter, right hand under the lip of the bar, his pinky curled unnaturally inward, pressing something, activating the recording device. Got you. Caleb opened the local control schema for smart devices and accessed the building's audio system, a cheap Bluetooth-enabled amplifier connected to the jukebox. He isolated the loop pattern from the bar's ambient noise. Every 44 seconds, the background sounds reset. Laughter at the same pitch, a glass clinked at the exact same moment, then a pause before ambient noise returned. A digital sleight of hand meant to disorient witnesses and mask whatever was really being said. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, extracting the artificial background noise and isolating the genuine conversations beneath. He'd learned this technique not from school, but from countless hours watching his father work, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. Luke had never hidden the darker aspects of the world from his son. Instead, he'd armed him with the tools to navigate them. Caleb tapped the microphone on his laptop and began recording his findings. If you're hearing this, it means the audio from Brewer's Bar has been looped. This is artificial background injected via a fixed interval device under the main bar counter. Confirm position beneath the leftmost tab. Suspicious contact officer, Rick Mason, timestamp, 1943. He uploaded the file to a secure Dropbox account tied to a contact in Washington, a digital journalist who had once covered a scandal involving 3 missing whistleblowers in North Carolina. She owed Luke Walker a favor, one of many accumulated during his years of service, that he rarely called in. Then Caleb reached into his backpack and pulled out a second phone, a burner preloaded with untraceable messaging apps. He sent one text, X, Phil Reddy Walker's compromised, and then another, 2 feds in hold, video incoming. He didn't need to know who'd respond. His father always said, you don't need 100 friends, Caleb. You just need 2 who owe you their lives. The message would reach the right people, former teammates, contacts in agencies whose acronyms weren't public knowledge, men and women who still remembered what Luke Walker had done for them in places that didn't appear on maps. Caleb leaned back, allowing himself a moment's rest. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on shoulders too young for such burdens. But his father had taught him to stay in the background, to be the ghost behind the glass, the invisible support that made visible heroism possible. Only this wasn't background anymore. His father was in danger, and the plan they had rehearsed dozens of times was now operational. The war had come to them, and Caleb was no longer just Luke Walker's son. He was his father's most powerful weapon. The tracking dot on his screen had stopped moving. Caleb zoomed in on the location, an old county maintenance shed off the maps, away from traffic cameras and civilian eyes, perfect for making someone disappear. He opened another program and began methodically accessing the digital footprint of Millstone County's law enforcement, duty rosters, vehicle logs, arrest records, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, names that appeared too often or not enough. Building a map not just of where his father was being held, but of the entire corrupt ecosystem that had made such a place possible. Then he noticed something, a name that appeared in dispatch logs but never in official reports. Ghost holds authorized by Sheriff Morton, but never entered into the judicial system. Dozens of them over the past year, handled personally by Rick Mason and a rotating crew of trusted deputies. Caleb's young face hardened with understanding beyond his years. This wasn't just corruption, it was systematic, organized, and his father had walked right into it. But so had they walked into Luke Walker's world, a world where contingency plans had contingency plans, where 12-year-old boys carried encrypted phones and steel ball bearings, where help might come from shadows deeper than those cast by Millstone's small-town conspiracy. Caleb's fingers returned to the keyboard, his momentary pause over. There was work to be done, signals to send, a father to save, and as he typed, a small smile formed on his lips, not of amusement but of grim determination. They thought they'd caught a drifter, a random do-gooder. Instead, they'd captured a ghost, a man who had disappeared from official records years ago for very good reasons. And they'd left his son, his greatest creation, free to operate. Back at the makeshift detention facility, Luke sat handcuffed to a metal chair, the fluorescent light overhead casting harsh shadows across his face. He hadn't spoken since his last exchange with Rick, letting silence do what words couldn't: create uncertainty, doubt space for imagination to fill with worst-case scenarios. The four officers had set up a perimeter. Rick pacing near the door, Kyle seated with his injured wrist propped on the makeshift card table, the two deputies standing guard with hands near their holstered weapons. They were waiting for something. Orders, perhaps, or courage to proceed with whatever came next in their playbook. Luke controlled his breathing, keeping it even measured, conserving energy, observing. The room they'd put him in didn't even have a clock. No ticking hands, no digital display, just four concrete walls, a rusted metal table, and the flickering bulb that swung slightly from the ceiling like a restless ghost. The kind of room designed not just to hold a man, but to erase him from memory, both his own and others. Footsteps approached from outside, measured deliberate, the walk of someone with authority rather than merely power. The door opened, and Rick's straightened tension visible in the set of his shoulders. Sheriff Morton stepped in, closing the door quietly behind him. His uniform was pressed despite the late-hour badge polished to a shine that reflected the room's harsh lighting. His eyes, small and deep-set in his fleshy face, assessed Luke with the detached interest of a man evaluating livestock. "Mr. Walker," he began, voice surprisingly soft for his bulk. "We find ourselves in an unfortunate situation." Luke didn't respond, didn't nod, gave no indication that he'd heard or understood. His eyes, however, never left Morton's face, tracking each micro-expression with practiced precision. Morton pulled up a folding chair, the metal legs scraping against concrete. He sat facing Luke, knees almost touching, creating an artificial intimacy meant to disarm. A technique Luke had seen used in interrogation rooms from Kandahar to Kiev. "I understand you're new to our little community," the sheriff continued. "Just passing through with your boy, protecting strangers in bars. Very admirable, very American." He smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "But you see, Millstone operates a certain way, has for generations. We take care of our own here, and sometimes that means managing outside influences. Those two women you defended, they're not who they claim to be." Luke's expression remained impassive, but his mind cataloged every word, every emphasis, building a profile of the man before him. His motivations, his weaknesses, his pressure points. Morton leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped as if in prayer. "I'm a reasonable man, Mr. Walker. I believe in second chances. You made a mistake tonight. Interfered in local police business, assaulted officers performing their duties. But mistakes can be rectified." He paused, waiting for a response that didn't come. Luke's silence was calculated. Each second of it transferred power from interrogator to subject, a lesson learned in environments far more hostile than this county's shed. Morton's smile faltered slightly. "Here's what I propose. You sign a statement admitting you were intoxicated, misunderstood the situation, and regrettably became violent. You'll be charged with simple assault, spend a night in our facility, pay a fine, and be on your way tomorrow, with your son, unharmed." The last word hung in the air, its implication clear. A threat wrapped in reassurance. Luke finally spoke, voice calm, measured. "And the federal agents," Morton waved a dismissive hand. "Those women aren't federal agents. They're corporate spies, industrial saboteurs, using fake credentials to access sensitive information. We've been tracking them for weeks." Luke's eyes never wavered, then verified their credentials. One phone call to Washington would confirm their identity. "Can't do that," Morton replied too quickly. "Lines of communication have been compromised. We believe they have associates intercepting calls to federal offices." The lie was obvious, clumsy. Luke almost felt insulted by its transparency. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "we both know what's happening here. The only question is whether you're smart enough to stop before it's too late." Morton's facade cracked just for an instant, anger flashing across his features before the mask of reasonable authority returned. "Too late for whom, Mr. Walker? You're alone, handcuffed in an unregistered facility. Your son is alone in a motel room in a town where every badge answers to me. Those women are being processed at a site even more remote than this one. There is no cavalry coming." Luke allowed himself the faintest of smiles, not of amusement, but of genuine pity. That's the problem with corruption, Sheriff. It makes you think everyone else is as isolated as you are. Morton stood abruptly, chair scraping backward, his face flushed, composure cracking. The reasonable veneer had worn thin, revealing the petty tyrant beneath. You think you understand how the world works? You think your service record means anything here? My service record was redacted years ago, Luke replied evenly, as was my identity, my history, my connections. That's why you can't find anything on me beyond a driver's license and a mechanical certification. That's why your facial recognition software returns zero matches despite running my image through every database you have access to. Morton's eyes widened slightly, confirmation that they had indeed tried to identify him through official channels and found nothing. You think you're holding Luke Walker, automotive specialist? Luke continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. But the man you're actually detaining hasn't existed on paper since 2016. And the people who know his real name aren't the kind who knock before entering. For the first time, genuine uncertainty crossed Morton's face. He masked it quickly, but not before Luke had seen it, the seed of doubt taking root. The sheriff turned to Rick, standing silently by the door. Get the deputy on monitor duty. Tell him to check the motel. Make sure the kid is still there. Rick nodded, stepping outside to make the call. Morton returned his attention to Luke, struggling to regain his authoritative demeanor. Nice try, Walker. But ghost stories don't scare me. I've been sheriff here for 15 years. I've buried problems bigger than you. Luke didn't respond. He'd said what needed saying. Now it was time to let fear do its work. The slow-growing, insidious kind that feeds on silence and uncertainty. The kind that makes men in power start questioning their own invulnerability. Outside, they heard Rick's voice, tense and demanding. Then silence. Then footsteps hurried, this time returning to the room. Rick reappeared in the doorway, face-pale, phone clutched in his hand. No answer from the motel patrol, he reported, voice tight. Jenkins isn't responding to radio calls either. Morton's flush deepened. Then send someone else. Rick swallowed visibly. I tried. Wilson's not answering either, and the channel's getting interference. Some kind of static or, I don't know, encrypted chatter maybe. The sheriff turned back to Luke, eyes narrowed. What did you do? Luke shrugged, the movement casual despite his restraints. I didn't do anything. I've been right here enjoying your hospitality. My son, on the other hand. Morton stepped closer, looming over Luke, one hand resting on his holstered weapon. What about your son? Luke looked up at him, calm as still water. He's 12 years old, loves robotics, reads at a college level, and he's been hacking government firewalls since he was 9. For fun. The fluorescent light chose that moment to flicker more violently, casting the room in alternating brightness and shadow that made Morton's face look ghoulish, haunted. A coincidence, but one that heightened the growing tension. You're bluffing, the sheriff said, but his voice lacked conviction. Luke leaned forward slightly, chains rattling. 3 miles east of here, there's an abandoned grain silo. Inside, you keep documentation on every ghost hold you've conducted in the past 5 years. 87 illegal detentions, 16 deaths ruled as accidents or suicides, all authorized with your signature using a code system you thought was unbreakable. Bluebird, Redwing, Nighthawk. The color drained from Morton's face. Those were the classified designations for their most sensitive operations, known only to him and his 3 most trusted deputies. How could you possibly— I don't know those things, Luke interrupted. But my son does now, and so do the 6 people he's sent that information to in the past hour, including a federal judge in the Eastern District who still owes me for Kandahar. Morton's hand moved to his gun, drawing it with shaking fingers. You're lying. Luke didn't flinch, didn't even look at the weapon. I don't need to lie, Sheriff. I just needed to buy time, and you've given me plenty of it. As if on cue, the lights went out, completely plunging the room into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in seconds later, dim red bulbs that cast everything in a bloody glow. Then came the sound, distant at first, then growing louder. Helicopter rotors cutting through the night air with rhythmic precision. Morton's radio crackled to life on his belt, a voice transmitting through waves of static. Perimeter breach. Multiple vehicles approaching from, unable to establish, federal markings. The sheriff stared at Luke, comprehension and fear dawning in his eyes. What are you? Just a mechanic, Luke answered quietly. who made the mistake of teaching his son everything he knows. Outside, the helicopter searchlight swept across the building, its beam visible through the room's single high window. The sound of vehicles on gravel doors opening and closing, voices calling commands with practiced efficiency. Not local law enforcement, something with more discipline, more purpose. Luke looked up at Morton, still standing frozen with his gun half raised. The mechanic's face showed no triumph, no satisfaction, just tired resignation at a scene he'd witnessed too many times before. "It's over, Sheriff. The only question now is how hard you make it on yourself." The helicopter's searchlight swept across the detention facility, casting harsh shadows that stretched like accusatory fingers across the weathered concrete. The rotor wash bent the tall grass surrounding the building, creating rippling waves that seemed to flee from the approaching storm. Federal agents in tactical gear moved with practiced efficiency, weapons at ready positions, spreading out to create a perimeter around the structure. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a reclamation. Inside, Sheriff Morton's face had drained of all color, the red emergency lights making his pallor appear even more corpse-like. His gun hung uselessly at his side as the reality of his situation crystallized. The kingdom he'd built on threats, favors, and buried secrets was crumbling in real time, brick by corrupt brick. Luke remained seated, still handcuffed, his expression calm, despite the chaos erupting around him. The rattling of the helicopter, the shouted commands outside, the radio static, none of it seemed to penetrate his center of gravity. He'd seen the fall of worse men in worse places. At least here, the collateral damage would be minimal. Rick Mason backed toward the wall, panic rising in his eyes like floodwater. "We need to run. We need to get out the back." Before the radio on Morton's belt crackled again, clearer this time. "Building secured, all exits covered. This is FBI Assistant Director Ellison. You have 2 minutes to release all detainees and exit with hands visible. After that, we breach." Morton's composure shattered completely, the mask of authority slipping to reveal the coward beneath. His voice cracked as he turned to Rick. "What did you do? What kind of hornet's nest did you kick?" Rick's face contorted with desperate rage. He lunged toward Luke, grabbing him by the collar. "You son of a bitch! Who are you? What is this?" Luke met his gaze without flinching, voice low enough that only Rick could hear. "I'm the man who's going to watch you walk out of here in handcuffs. But whether you walk or get carried depends on what happens in the next 90 seconds. The building's main door burst open, the metal frame buckling under the force of a battering ram. Light flooded in, harsh, uncompromising, revealing. A team of agents flowed through the entrance like water finding the path of least resistance, moving with the synchronized precision that comes from hundreds of hours of training. Leading them was Assistant Director Lynn Ellison, mid-50s, silver-streaked, dark hair pulled back in a severe bun pantsuit, impeccable despite the hour and circumstances. She surveyed the scene with practiced eyes, cataloging threats, assets, and collateral in seconds. Her gaze settled on Luke, recognition flickering briefly before professional detachment reasserted itself. "Gentlemen, you are currently detaining a federal asset and 2 federal agents without warrant or cause." She gestured toward the deputies who had already raised their hands. Weapons on the floor, slowly. Morton found his voice, though it quavered with indignation rather than authority. "Now wait just a minute. This is my jurisdiction. You have no right to. My authority supersedes county lines when federal agents are being illegally detained." Ellison's voice cut through his bluster like a scalpel through tissue. "Especially when those detentions occur in unregistered facilities following the apparent assault and attempted murder of said agents. Agents move forward, securing weapons, applying restraints. The well-oiled machine of federal law enforcement dismantling a local operation with clinical efficiency." Rick struggled briefly as cuffs were applied, earning himself a knee to the back that drove the fight from him in a pained wheeze. Ellison approached Luke, producing a key from her pocket. She unlocked his handcuffs, personally professional courtesy rather than protocol. "Mr. Walker," she said quietly, "it's been a while." Luke rubbed his wrists, circulation returning painfully to compressed nerves. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Not long enough, Lynn." She stepped back, observing him with the careful assessment of someone who knew precisely what she was looking at and what it was capable of. "Your son contacted us. Smart kid. Smarter than anyone gave him credit for." Luke stood, rolling shoulders stiff from forced stillness. "He takes after his mother. Where is he now? Safe. We picked him up from the motel 20 minutes ago. He's waiting in our mobile command center with Agent Hart. Both of them, actually. Her expression softened fractionally. You should know, those women you protected. They're the real thing. Deep cover working a corruption case that just got a lot bigger thanks to you. Luke nodded once, processing this information without visible reaction. I need to see my son. Ellison led him outside into the cool night air, now filled with the controlled chaos of a federal operation in progress. Vehicles with government plates lined the dirt road, in securing the perimeter, processing the detained officers. Evidence techs photographed the facility, documenting every aspect of the illegal detention site that would soon feature in federal court proceedings. A black SUV sat at the edge of the activity doors, open interior lights, illuminating three figures inside. Caleb sat in the back seat, laptop still open on his knees, flanked by Dominique and Danielle Hart. The boy looked up as his father approached, relief washing over his young face. Luke moved toward him with measured steps that belied the fierce protectiveness surging through his chest. His son was safe. That was all that mattered. The rest was just cleanup. Caleb slid out of the vehicle, standing tall, despite exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. Dad, he said the word, carrying more than its single syllable could normally hold. I tracked your cruiser using the county dispatch system backdoor. Sent the coordinates to the FBI contact list you had encrypted on your backup drive. Luke placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the touch conveying what words couldn't. Pride, relief, gratitude. The boy had executed their emergency protocols, flawlessly activated contingencies that had been prepared but never expected to be needed. You did good, son. Better than good. Dominique Hart emerged from the SUV, her professional mask firmly back in place now that the immediate danger had passed. The tailored blazer that had earlier marked her as out of place in a small-town bar now seemed perfectly appropriate amidst the federal operation. Mr. Walker, I believe we owe you an explanation and an apology. Luke shook his head slightly. You don't owe me anything. I saw two people being threatened and did what anyone should do. Not anyone would have dismantled a county-wide corruption ring in a single night, Danielle added, joining her sister. Her eyes held genuine admiration as she studied the father and son, or managed to expose evidence that we've been trying to uncover for 3 months. Caleb's cheeks colored slightly at the implied praise, but his posture remained confident. I just followed the patterns. Once I accessed Sheriff Morton's private server, everything was connected. The ghost detentions, the missing persons reports, the offshore accounts. It was like they weren't even trying to hide it. Assistant Director Ellison approached the group, her expression grim. They weren't hiding it because they didn't think they needed to. Morton has been sheriff for 15 years, running this county like his personal fiefdom. No one questioned him because everyone who did vanished into places like that. She nodded toward the detention facility. We've been tracking disappearances along this corridor for months, but couldn't pinpoint the source. Dominique's professional veneer cracked slightly, revealing the frustration beneath. We've been undercover for 12 weeks, posing as consultants for the Regional Water Authority. The infrastructure contracts for this county showed irregularities, massive overspending with minimal results. When we started asking questions, we became targets. Danielle continued. But we couldn't get concrete evidence of who was pulling the strings. Every time we got close, the trail went cold. Witnesses backed out. Records disappeared. Luke listened, mentally assembling the pieces. So tonight at the bar wasn't random. They were setting you up. Dominique nodded. We've been staying at Brewer's Motel, coming to the bar in the evenings to observe. Mason and his partner started making contact 3 nights ago, getting more aggressive each time. Tonight was clearly meant to be the culmination. Provoke a confrontation, arrest us for assaulting officers, make us disappear into their system. She hesitated, then added, what we didn't count on was you. Caleb looked up from his laptop where he'd been monitoring the ongoing operation. They had a recording device under the bar, set to loop ambient noise every 44 seconds to mask whatever they did or said. I isolated the real audio. They were planning to drug your drinks, stage evidence of you attacking them. Luke's expression hardened as he absorbed this information. It explained the choreographed nature of the confrontation. The too convenient arrival of Sheriff Morton, the immediate escalation to a ghost detention rather than normal processing. So what changed their plan? Ellison asked, looking between Luke and the agents. I did, Luke replied simply. They weren't expecting a third party to intervene, force them to improvise. A tactical error on their part, Dominique observed. If they'd stuck to the original targets, they might have succeeded. Instead, they expanded to include you, which brought in... She glanced at Caleb, unexpected variables. The boy smiled slightly at being referred to as a variable, though his eyes remained serious beyond their years. His fingers continued typing, extracting and organizing information from the county's systems while they still had access. I'm downloading everything I can find on their operation, financial records, detention logs, communications. It's extensive. They've been running this for years. Ellison checked her watch, then gestured to a nearby agent. We need to move. Now that we've breached their operation, any Confederates will be destroying evidence. I want teams at the sheriff's office, the county records building, and Morton's residence within 15 minutes. The agent nodded and moved off, relaying orders through his radio. Ellison turned back to Luke. We need to get you and your son to a secure location. You've stirred up a hornet's nest here, and we don't know how far the corruption extends. Luke shook his head. We can take care of ourselves. Just point us toward the nearest motel outside county lines. Dominique stepped forwards, authority in her stance, despite her civilian clothes. Mr. Walker, with all due respect, that's not an option. You're material witnesses in a federal investigation now. And given what your son has uncovered, potentially targets for anyone connected to Morton's operation who remains at large. Luke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd spent 8 years carefully maintaining his and Caleb's anonymity, staying off grids, avoiding entanglements with official systems. Now they were being pulled back into exactly the kind of visibility he'd worked to escape. Caleb looked up from his screen, reading his father's tension with the intuition born of years spent as each other's only constant. Dad, we should go with them, at least until we know who else might be involved. His eyes held understanding beyond his years. He knew what this meant, what it might cost them, but he also recognized the necessity. Ellison's voice softened slightly, recognizing Luke's reluctance. It's just protective custody, Luke. 48 hours max while we process what we found and ensure there's no immediate threat. Then you're free to go. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Where had Luke Walker been for the past 8 years? Why did a former special operations veteran and with his record disappear into the civilian world so completely that even federal databases had lost track of him? These were questions for another time. Ellison was professional enough to recognize when to press and when to wait. Luke finally nodded, a short, sharp movement that conveyed acceptance rather than agreement. 48 hours, then we're gone. The SUV pulled away from the detention facility, leaving behind the flashing lights and organized chaos of the ongoing operation. Inside, Luke and Caleb sat in the middle row, the Hart twins in the back and Ellison in the passenger seat beside a driver who hadn't introduced himself, but moved with the alert efficiency of someone with specialized training. They traveled in silence for several miles, the darkness of rural backroads eventually giving way to the ambient glow of a larger town on the horizon. Hayesville, the county seat of the neighboring jurisdiction, far enough from Morton's influence to serve as a temporary base of operations. Caleb continued working on his laptop, fingers dancing across the keys with practiced precision. His face, illuminated by the blue glow of the screen, showed none of the trauma or fear that might be expected from a child who had just navigated a dangerous situation. Instead, his expression reflected deep concentration, occasionally punctuated by small frowns when he encountered something unexpected in the data. Luke watched him with quiet pride tempered by concern. His son had performed flawlessly tonight, implementing emergency protocols they'd established years ago, but never actually needed. The boy had proven himself capable beyond what most adults could manage under pressure. But that capability had come at a cost. A childhood shaped by contingency plans, escape routes, and the constant awareness that the world contained dangers most people preferred to ignore. The SUV pulled into a hotel parking lot, not the roadside motel variety that Luke and Caleb typically frequented, but a mid-tier business hotel anonymous enough to blend in but secure enough for federal purposes. The kind with interior hallways, security cameras, and staff who were trained not to ask questions when government credentials were presented. Ellison turned in her seat. We've arranged connecting rooms on the 3rd floor. Security detail outside. Room service available if you need it. Her eyes met Luke's, professional, but not unkind. Get some rest. We'll debrief in the morning. Luke nodded once, acknowledging the consideration while maintaining his guard. Trust came hard after years of vigilance, even with people he'd once worked alongside. The Hart twins exited, first moving with the synchronized efficiency of people who had operated as a unit for years. They positioned themselves at the entrance, scanning for threats out of habit rather than immediate concern. Luke and Caleb followed the boy, closing his laptop, but keeping it tucked securely under his arm. 8 years on the move had taught him the value of portable information. Everything that mattered could be carried, everything else was disposable. The hotel room was standard corporate bland, beige walls, generic artwork furnishings, designed for function rather than comfort. 2 queen beds, a desk, a television that would remain unused. Luke performed a quick sweep by habit, checking sight lines from the windows, noting emergency exits, assessing potential defensive positions. Old patterns deeply ingrained. Caleb set up his equipment on the desk, connecting to the hotel's Wi-Fi through a series of proxies that would mask their digital fingerprint. The boy moved with the practiced efficiency of someone performing a familiar ritual. This wasn't the first hotel room he converted into a temporary command center. "You should sleep," Luke suggested, noting the shadows beneath his son's eyes, the slight droop of his shoulders now that the immediate danger had passed. Caleb shook his head, gesturing toward his screen. "Almost done compiling the evidence. I want to have everything backed up and secured before I sleep." His voice held the quiet determination that reminded Luke so much of Sarah, Caleb's mother, who had approached every task, no matter how small, with the same unwavering focus. Luke didn't argue. He understood the need to complete a mission properly, to secure all variables before standing down. Instead, he moved to the window, positioning himself where he could watch both the parking lot below and his son's reflection in the glass. A sentinel's habit: always position yourself to monitor multiple vectors simultaneously. The lights of Hayesville spread out before him, a modest tapestry of street lamps and neon signs marking a town large enough to have chain restaurants, but small enough that most businesses close by 10. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware of the corruption festering just one county over, unaware of the thin line between order and exploitation, between protection and predation. Dad Caleb's voice broke through his thoughts. "I found something weird in the county records." Luke moved to the desk, leaning over his son's shoulder to view the screen. Lines of code and database entries filled the display, meaningless to most, but a readable pattern to them both. Caleb pointed to a sequence of entries. "These are requisition orders for the county sheriff's department over the past 3 years. Standard stuff mostly. Vehicle maintenance, ammunition, office supplies. But then these entries started appearing 8 months ago." He highlighted several lines. "Equipment purchases routed through a shell company called Milestone Security Consultants. Surveillance gear, specialized restraints, sound dampening materials." Luke frowned, studying the pattern. None of it standard for a small-town sheriff's department, all of it useful for extra-legal detention operations. "That's not all," Caleb continued, switching to another window. "The company's registered to an Aaron Stone. And here's where it gets interesting. Stone is CEO of Rivertech Industries. They've been bidding on government contracts throughout the state, especially water treatment and infrastructure projects." Understanding dawned in Luke's eyes. The same sector the Hart twins were investigating. Caleb nodded, seeing his father make the connection. "I checked Rivertech's competition. Guess who their main rival is for the regional water treatment contract? Hart Technologies." Luke supplied pieces falling into place. Owned by Alexander Hart, Dominique and Danielle's father. Caleb pulled up another document, a corporate profile showing a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, standing behind a podium emblazoned with the Hart Technologies logo. Net worth estimated at $3.7 billion. The company specializes in advanced water purification systems, mostly government and international contracts. Luke straightened, processing this new information. So the Hart twins weren't just random federal agents assigned to investigate corruption. They were investigating corruption that directly threatened their family business. Caleb looked up at his father, uncertainty in his young eyes. "Should we tell Agent Ellison?" Luke considered the question carefully. On one hand, potential conflict of interest could compromise the investigation. On the other, the Hart twins had nearly been abducted and possibly killed tonight. Their motives for being in Millstone might be complex, but the danger they faced had been real enough. Yes, he decided. But in the morning, let everyone rest first. Clear heads make better decisions. A soft knock at the connecting door interrupted their conversation. Luke moved instinctively between Caleb and the potential threat, body tensing, despite the controlled environment. "It's us," came Dominique Hart's voice through the door. "We need to talk." Luke exchanged a glance with Caleb, who quickly minimized his research windows. Something in the timing felt too coincidental. Had their room been monitored, or were the Hart twins simply following the same investigative threads? He opened the connecting door to find both women standing there, still fully dressed despite the late hour. Dominique had removed her blazer, but remained in her tailored shirt and slacks, every inch the federal professional. Danielle had changed into jeans and a simple black t-shirt, looking more relaxed but no less alert. "Sorry to disturb you," Dominique began, her voice measured, "but there are things you need to know that can't wait until morning." Luke stepped aside, allowing them to enter, but maintaining his position between them and Caleb. The boy had casually positioned his laptop to prevent easy viewing of the screen, a precaution that would have seemed paranoid in most 12-year-olds, but was simply standard procedure for Caleb Walker. Danielle spoke first, her tone more direct than her sister's careful diplomacy. "We know you've been looking into us, into our family." Caleb's eyes widened slightly, confirmation of their suspicion that the room was being monitored in some way. Luke's expression remained neutral, giving away nothing. Standard procedure when assessing a situation with unknown variables. Dominique sighed a small break in her composed facade. "This isn't how we wanted this conversation to happen, but circumstances have forced our hand." She looked directly at Luke. "Yes, we are federal agents. Yes, we were investigating corruption in Millstone County. But there's more to the story. Our father's company is bidding on a major water treatment contract for this region." Danielle continued. "3 months ago, one of his lead engineers disappeared after reporting irregularities in the bidding process. Signs of insider information being leaked, specifications being altered to favor a competitor. That competitor being Rivertech Industries." Luke supplied, watching their reactions carefully. Dominique nodded, unsurprised that they had already uncovered this connection. "Aaron Stone has been underbidding Hart Technologies on every major contract in the region, somehow always knowing exactly what our proposals contain. I'm guessing the missing engineer turned up in Millstone County." Caleb added, his young voice serious beyond his years. Danielle's expression darkened. "In a manner of speaking, his body was found in Lake Millstone 3 weeks after he disappeared, ruled an accidental drowning by the county coroner. Despite their federal credentials, we couldn't get jurisdiction to investigate properly." Dominique explained. "No evidence of foul play in the official report, no witnesses, nothing concrete to justify federal involvement. So we went undercover." Luke processed this information mentally, reassessing the situation and its players. If the Hart twins were telling the truth, they had personal as well as professional motivations for their investigation, the kind that might lead federal agents to bend rules to operate in gray areas where official channels failed. "Why are you telling us this now?" he asked, watching them carefully for signs of deception or manipulation. Dominique and Danielle exchanged a glance, some silent communication passing between them. Then Dominique reached into her pocket and withdrew her phone, placing it on the table between them. "Because of this." She tapped the screen, bringing up an email that had arrived within the last hour. Luke leaned forward to read it, Caleb moving to his side. The message was brief, unmarked by official headers or signatures. "Back off, or the boy disappears next. We have her bomb beyond Millstone." The implications were clear. Someone connected to the conspiracy knew about Caleb, knew he was with federal agents, and was making direct threats. Someone with access to federal communications with visibility into the ongoing operation. "How did you receive this?" Luke's voice had dropped to a dangerous register, the calm of a predator assessing a threat to its young. "My secured federal email account," Dominique replied, "which means either someone very skilled has hacked a protected government server or the threat comes from inside the Bureau." Luke finished. His mind rapidly calculated possibilities, threat vectors, escape routes. Old instincts, never truly dormant, surging back to full alert. Caleb had already turned back to his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. "I can trace the message origin," he said, focus narrowing to the technical challenge. Danielle shook her head. "Don't bother. It was routed through multiple proxies designed to be untraceable." "Professional work," she looked at Luke. This is bigger than a corrupt sheriff and his deputies, bigger than industrial espionage or contract fraud. Whatever Stone and Morton have built here, it has tentacles in federal agencies. The implications settled over the room like a physical weight. If they couldn't trust the FBI, who could they trust? The very system that was supposed to provide protection had become a potential threat. Luke's decision was immediate and absolute. "We're leaving. Now, you can't," Dominique protested. "You're under federal protection. If you walk out." "If we stay, we're sitting targets," Luke countered. "The only reason Caleb is still safe is because whoever sent that message doesn't know we're aware of the threat. The moment Ellison reports to her superiors in the morning, that advantage disappears." Danielle studied him with new understanding, recognizing the calculation of a man who had navigated hostile territory before. "Where will you go?" The question wasn't a challenge. It was professional assessment. Luke didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned to Caleb, who had already begun shutting down his systems, preparing for rapid movement. The boy worked with practiced efficiency, saving critical data to encrypted drives, wiping local caches, leaving no digital footprint behind. Dominique watched this well-rehearsed procedure with growing comprehension. "This isn't the first time you've had to disappear, is it? You've been running from something long before tonight." Luke met her gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying her assessment. "The less you know, the safer you are. Both of you." He began gathering their minimal belongings, each movement precise and economical. "We'll be gone in 5 minutes. You never saw us leave." Danielle stepped forward, decision made. "We're coming with you." Luke paused, evaluating this unexpected development. "No, you'll slow us down, and you're federal agents. Going off-grid makes you fugitives." "We're already targets," Dominique countered. "Whoever sent that threat knows we've gotten too close to something they want buried. If we stay in the system, we're as vulnerable as you are." The sisters stood side by side, their usual differences in demeanor melded into unified determination. For the first time, Luke truly saw them as twins rather than contrasting personalities. The same resolve burned behind their eyes, the same calculation in their posture. Caleb looked up from his final preparations, assessing the women with the same careful consideration his father was applying. His voice was quiet but decisive. "They should come, Dad. Their father owns Heart Technologies. They have resources we don't, and they know more about Stone and what he's after." Luke weighed the variables in silence. Traveling alone had always been safer. Fewer variables, faster movement, smaller footprint. But Caleb was right. The Hart twins brought resources, information, and training that could prove valuable against an enemy whose reach extended into federal agencies. And if they were being honest about the threat to their family business, their motivation was personal enough to ensure loyalty. "You follow my lead," he finally said, the decision made. "No calls to your bureau contacts, no credit cards, no phones. You do exactly as I say when I say it, without question or hesitation." The twins nodded in unison, accepting his terms without argument. They recognized the voice of experience when they heard it, the quiet authority of someone who had navigated wilderness, literal and figurative, and emerged intact. 5 minutes, Luke repeated, checking his watch. "Be ready to move." As the Hart twins returned to their room to prepare, Luke turned to Caleb, who had already packed his equipment with the efficiency of long practice. Their eyes met in silent communication, the unspoken language of two people who had been each other's only constant in a shifting world. "You sure about this?" Luke's glance asked. Caleb nodded, once determination beyond his years in the set of his jaw. "They need us as much as we need them." Together, father and son performed the final checks of their emergency protocol, the routine they had practiced monthly for years but never actually implemented. Until tonight, identities wiped, trails obscured, physical evidence minimized. The art of disappearing taught by a master to his most dedicated student. The Hart twins reappeared exactly 4 minutes later, each carrying a small go bag with essential items. Their federal identities had been hidden away. Badges, credentials, government-issued devices all left behind in the hotel room. They had transformed themselves from agents to civilians in minutes, adaptability that spoke to their training and experience. Luke performed a final sweep of the room, ensuring no traceable evidence remained. Then he turned to the group, his son and the two women who had, through circumstance and choice, become entangled in their carefully guarded existence. 4 people united by a conspiracy none of them fully understood yet, but which had nearly claimed all their lives in different ways. We moved to the stairwell, not the elevator, he instructed quietly. Service exit on the ground floor leads to the back parking lot. Stay close, stay quiet. If anything happens, Caleb knows the rendezvous point. The boy nodded, the weight of responsibility sitting comfortably on his young shoulders. He had been preparing for this scenario his entire conscious life. The day when the shadows his father had spent years evading finally caught up to them. Luke opened the door, checked the hallway, then gestured the group forward. As they moved silently toward the stairwell, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, illuminating the beginning of a day that would find 4 empty beds and a hotel room wiped clean of fingerprints and evidence, as if its occupants had never existed at all. Behind them in the darkness of the room, they had just abandoned Dominique's phone screen, lit up with an incoming call from Assistant Director Ellison. It rang 7 times before going to voicemail, its urgent warning unheard, as 4 figures slipped into the gray light of early morning, vanishing like smoke into the awakening town. Dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor strokes of amber, and rose, casting long shadows across the abandoned gas station where Luke had parked their newly acquired vehicle. Not stolen, purchased for cash from a lot so disreputable, it didn't ask questions about middle-of-the-night transactions. A 10-year-old Chevy Tahoe with faded paint and 180,000 miles on the odometer, but the engine purred like a contented cat under Luke's experienced hands. Mechanical solidity trumped appearances when your life depended on reliability. Caleb sat in the passenger seat, laptop balanced on his knees, power connected to an adapter Luke had rigged to draw directly from the vehicle's electrical system. The boy's eyes reflected the blue glow of the screeny face set in concentration that belonged on someone 3 times his age. He had slept briefly during the drive, 45 minutes of tactical rest, the kind that refreshed without surrendering awareness. A skill he'd inherited from watching his father. In the back seat, Dominique and Danielle Hart maintained their own vigil, their professional training evident in the way they monitored their surroundings despite obvious exhaustion. They had adapted to the situation with impressive speed, following Luke's protocols without question, offering suggestions only when asked. The transformation from federal agents to fugitives had occurred with a fluidity that suggested this wasn't entirely unfamiliar territory for them either. They'd driven through the night, changing direction repeatedly, using back roads and service routes that didn't appear on standard GPS. Luke had disabled the Tahoe's built-in navigation system within minutes of purchase, removing any possibility of remote tracking. Old habits from a life that had supposedly ended 8 years ago, muscle memory that had never quite faded. "I've got something," Caleb announced, his fingers pausing over the keyboard. His voice carried the quiet excitement of discovery rather than fear. "The records I downloaded show regular payments from Rivertech to Morton's offshore account starting 18 months ago. But that's not the interesting part. 3 federal employees also received payments through the same channel. One in the EPA regional office, one at the Army Corps of Engineers, and one at the FBI field office in Charlotte." The Hart twins leaned forward, professional interest overriding fatigue. Dominique's eyes narrowed as she studied the screen over Caleb's shoulder. "Can you identify them?" Caleb shook his head, frustration evident in the set of his mouth. "Account numbers only, no names, but the timing matches inspection dates for Hart Technologies' water treatment proposals. Every time your company submitted plans for regulatory approval, these accounts received payments 3 to 5 days later. And then the approvals were delayed or rejected on technical grounds." Danielle added the pieces connecting in her mind. "While Rivertech's proposals sailed through despite inferior specifications." Luke watched the exchange, silently mentally processing the implications. The corruption extended beyond a small-town sheriff into federal agencies that controlled billions in infrastructure contracts. The kind of money that made people disappear when they asked the wrong questions, like the Hart Technologies engineer who had ended up in Lake Millstone. "We need to identify those federal employees," Dominique said, her voice taking on the precision of an agent building a case. "Without names, we don't know who sent that threat, who might be tracking us, or how high this goes." Caleb's fingers resumed their dance across the keyboard. "I can try to cross-reference the payment dates with personnel records, see who had access to the relevant files when the money moved. But it'll take time, and we'll need a secure connection. This hotspot I'm using has limited bandwidth." Luke checked his watch, a simple, non-smart timepiece that couldn't be tracked or hacked. "We need to keep moving, 20 minutes max at any stop." He studied the roadmap spread across the dashboard, deliberately analog another precaution against digital footprints. We'll head southwest, find a place to hole up during daylight hours. Small town cache, only no cameras. The Hart twins exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Then Danielle spoke, her voice careful but determined. We have a better option. Our family owns a hunting cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Off-grid solar-powered satellite internet that isn't connected to any hard technology systems. No paper trail linking it to us. Luke's expression remained neutral, but his mind rapidly assessed the new variable. A private location unknown to potential pursuers offered advantages, but also risks, primarily dependency on the Hart twins' reliability. We've survived this long without safe houses. Dominique met his gaze, directly challenged in her eyes. And how long has that been exactly? How many years have you and Caleb been living off the grid, moving from town to town? She gestured toward the boy. He deserves a chance to work with looking over his shoulder every 20 minutes. We all do if we're going to unravel this. The words struck closer to home than Luke would admit. 8 years of constant vigilance, of teaching his son to live like a ghost in a world that demanded digital visibility. Caleb had never complained, had embraced the skills and precautions as a game at first, then as a way of life. But Luke saw the toll it took. The wariness in eyes too young for such caution, the isolation from peers, the burden of secrets no child should have to carry. He made his decision, weighing security against necessity. The cabin, but we approach, carefully check for surveillance and maintain escape routes at all times. Any sign of compromise, we're gone. Relief flickered across Danielle's features before professional composure reasserted itself. She provided coordinates rather than an address. Another indication that the Hart twins understood operational security. Luke adjusted their route accordingly, calculating fuel needs, travel time, and potential choke points along the way. As they pulled back onto the empty highway, the rising sun at their backs, Caleb closed his laptop and turned to his father. His voice was quiet, meant only for Luke's ears. They're not telling us everything. Luke nodded almost imperceptibly, eyes never leaving the road. Nobody ever does, son. The question is whether what they're holding back will get us killed. They drove in silence for the next hour, each lost in private calculations. The landscape gradually transformed from flat farmland to rolling hills, then to the more dramatic terrain of the approaching mountains. The Tahoe climbed steadily, engine straining slightly against the increasing grade, but maintaining the reliable performance that had informed Luke's selection. Dominique broke the silence as they turned onto a narrower road that wound between towering pines. Our father doesn't know we're federal agents. She delivered this revelation without preamble, her voice steady despite the significance of the admission. He thinks we work for the company. Dominique in R&D, me in corporate security. We've maintained the cover for 5 years. Luke's hands remained steady on the wheel, but his attention sharpened. That's a long-term undercover operation. Not standard bureau procedure. It's not a bureau operation, Danielle clarified. At least not officially. We joined the FBI after college, but when we discovered security breaches at Hart Technologies 3 years ago, we approached our supervisor with a proposal. We'd investigate from the inside using our family connection for access. The Bureau denied the request. Dominique continued. Conflict of interest. So we took leaves of absence and did it anyway. When we found evidence of corporate espionage that crossed state lines, we were reinstated as special agents assigned to white-collar crimes. But our father still doesn't know. Caleb had reopened his laptop, fingers moving across the keys as he processed this new information. The screen illuminated his frown of concentration. So when you came to Millstone, we were operating with federal authority but limited support, Danielle confirmed. No backup, minimal resources, and strict instructions to maintain cover at all costs. When things went sideways at Brewer's Bar, we couldn't call for immediate help without revealing our location to potential infiltrators in the Bureau. Luke absorbed this information with the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to recalibrating mission parameters on the fly. The picture was becoming clearer. Not just industrial espionage or local corruption, but a multi-layered operation with tentacles reaching into federal agencies. The kind of conspiracy that justified the precautions he'd been taking for years. The kind that vindicated his paranoia. We're being followed, Caleb announced suddenly, eyes on the laptop screen rather than the road behind them. He'd connected a small device to his computer, a custom-built signal detector that scanned for electronic transmissions in their vicinity. Drone approximately 2 miles back, maintaining our speed and trajectory. Military grade based on the encryption signature. Luke's reaction was immediate and practiced. He didn't accelerate or make any obvious evasive maneuvers that would alert their pursuer. Instead, he maintained speed while scanning the road ahead for tactical opportunities. "How long?" "Picked it up about 3 minutes ago," Caleb replied, fingers flying across the keyboard as he attempted to hack the drone's control system. "But the signal pattern suggests it's been tracking us longer. It's good tech, keeps distance, varies altitude to minimize visual detection." Dominique leaned forward, professionalism overriding concern. "How did they find us?" "We ditched all electronics, paid cash, switched vehicles." Luke's mind worked through possibilities, eliminating options systematically. No digital trail, no credit cards, no phones. The Tahoe was too old for built-in tracking. Which left? The hotel. Security cameras in the lobby or parking lot. Facial recognition. Danielle cursed softly. "The Bureau has access to the National Facial Recognition Database. If someone inside is compromised, they could track us through traffic, cameras, security systems, anything with visual feeds." Dominique finished the implications, settling over the group like a physical weight. Caleb looked up from his screen, determination replacing concern. "I can't hack the drone directly, military encryption, but I can jam its transmission frequency. It won't take it down, but it'll blind it temporarily." "Do it," Luke ordered, already scanning the approaching tree line for opportunities. "We need a visual break, dense cover." Ahead, the mountain road curved sharply around a massive rock formation, creating a natural blind spot. Beyond it, the forest thickened, providing potential cover if they could leave the main road without being observed. Luke calculated speed angles, timing, the mathematics of evasion he'd once performed under much more hostile conditions. Caleb activated his jammer as they approached the curve. The small device hummed to life, broadcasting interference across the frequencies his scanner had detected. "Ready in 3, 2, 1. Luke hit the curve at precisely the calculated speed, then executed a perfect handbrake turn into a narrow fire access road that cut into the dense forest. The Tahoe fishtailed slightly on the unpaved surface before the tires found purchase. He killed the headlights immediately, relying on ambient dawn light filtering through the canopy as they penetrated deeper into the woods. The access road narrowed further, barely wider than the vehicle branches, scraping against the sides like seeking fingers. Luke navigated with the precision of someone who had driven under far worse conditions: night operations without lights, desert tracks with active hostiles. Compared to those, a forest road in daylight was almost leisurely. After a half-mile of increasingly rough terrain, the road opened into a small clearing bordered by a sheer rock face on one side. Luke pulled the Tahoe alongside the natural formation where overhanging trees would help conceal it from aerial observation once the drone regained its tracking capabilities. "Jammer's battery is almost drained," Caleb reported, monitoring the device's status. "We've got maybe 2 minutes of coverage left." Luke was already out of the vehicle, assessing their position with the practiced eye of someone who had established defensive perimeters on 3 continents. Natural rock formation providing cover on one side, dense forest with multiple escape routes, limited lines of sight for potential hostiles. Not ideal, but defensible if necessary. Dominique and Danielle emerged from the back seat, their movements betraying their federal training. Efficient, alert hands instinctively checking for weapons that weren't there. They'd surrendered their service pistols when going underground, another sacrifice to anonymity. "Jammer's down," Caleb announced, powering off the device to preserve any remaining charge. "Drone will reacquire the road, but it won't have our turn captured in its footage. As long as we stay under the canopy, we should be invisible to standard visual scanning." Luke nodded, mentally calculating their next move. Aerial search patterns would eventually expand to include forest access roads. They had perhaps 30-45 minutes before methodical searchers would check this location. "We continue on foot. Grab only what you can carry without restricting movement." They worked quickly, gathering essential supplies with the efficiency of people accustomed to rapid deployment. Caleb packed his equipment into a specially designed backpack, waterproof, impact-resistant, with an integrated solar charger. The Hart twins traveled even lighter, their go-bags containing only the most critical supplies. Luke performed a final sweep of the vehicle, removing any evidence of their presence before shouldering his own pack. "How far to the cabin?" he asked, glancing at Dominique as he checked the position of the sun to orient himself. "About 7 miles northeast," she replied, already consulting a topographical map she'd retrieved from her bag. "Rough terrain, but manageable. There's a ridge system we can follow that provides cover while avoiding the deepest valleys." Luke studied the map, tracing potential routes with a calloused finger. The wilderness navigation was familiar territory for him, literal rather than metaphorical for once. He identified 3 possible approaches, assessing each for security, efficiency, and defensibility. "We'll take the middle ridge, then drop down to approach from the west. Longest route, but best cover." He looked at Caleb, concern momentarily overriding tactical considerations. "You good for a hike?" The boy shouldered his pack with quiet determination, checking the straps with practiced hands. "I did 12 miles with full gear in the Adirondacks last year. This is just a morning walk." Pride flickered across Luke's features, not just at his son's physical capability, but at the resilience that had developed alongside it. Caleb had never experienced a normal childhood by conventional standards, but he had gained skills and confidence that most adults never achieved. The trade-off was necessary, Luke had always told himself. Necessary for survival. They moved out in single file, Luke taking point, Caleb behind him, the Hart twins following. The formation wasn't discussed. It established itself naturally based on skills and roles. Luke led because wilderness navigation and threat assessment were second nature to him. Caleb followed because his father could best protect him from the front spotting dangers before they materialized. The twins took rear positions, covering their backs, while deferring to Luke's superior experience in this environment. The forest embraced them, ancient trees creating a cathedral of dappled light and shadow. Pine needles cushioned their steps, minimizing sound and sparing energy. Birds resumed their morning songs after briefly quieting at the group's approach, a good sign. Birds were excellent early warning systems. Their behavior normalized only in the absence of perceived threats. They climbed steadily, following game trails where available, creating their own path where necessary. Luke set a pace that balanced speed with sustainability, fast enough to put distance between them and potential pursuers, measured enough to prevent exhaustion. The Hart twins matched it without complaint, their physical conditioning evident in their steady breathing and sure footing. Caleb moved with the adaptability of youth and the technique of someone extensively trained. He'd been hiking remote terrain with his father since he could walk, learning to read landscapes, to move efficiently across challenging ground, to recognize natural resources and hazards. The wilderness had been his classroom as much as mathematics or literature. 2 hours into their journey, they reached a rocky outcropping that provided a natural rest point and observation post. Luke signaled a brief halt, allowing the group to hydrate and assess their progress. From this vantage, they could see for miles across the forested valleys and ridges of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a rolling emerald ocean stretching to the horizon. The view was breathtaking, ancient, enduring, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath its canopy. Luke scanned the visible portions of the road they'd abandoned, looking for any sign of search patterns or pursuit. Nothing obvious yet, but that meant little. Professional trackers would be methodical, patient, and visible until they closed distance. Caleb joined him at the edge of the outcropping, taking a careful sip from his water bottle. His young eyes followed his father's gaze, learning from observation as he always had. "They won't expect us to cover this much ground on foot," he noted, voice quiet but confident. "Most people stick to roads, trails, populated areas." Luke nodded, allowing a small measure of approval to show. "Most people aren't prepared for this kind of movement. We are." He glanced back at the Hart twins, who were consulting their map while maintaining awareness of their surroundings. "They're keeping up better than I expected." Caleb followed his father's gaze, studying the women with the analytical eye he'd developed through years of watching Luke assess people and situations. Danielle was former military before the FBI, he observed. The way she moves, checks sight lines, positions herself. Not just training, experience. Luke raised an eyebrow, impressed by his son's perception. Something Dominique didn't mention about her sister. Another piece of the puzzle they were still assembling. The Hart twins contained more layers than initially apparent. Federal agents with corporate connections, daughters of a billionaire who lived undercover within their own family business, women whose skills and knowledge went beyond their official backgrounds. 5 more minutes, he decided, calculating remaining daylight against distance to their destination. Movement in daylight offered better visibility at the cost of potential exposure. Night travel would provide better concealment, but slower progress through unfamiliar terrain. The optimal window would be dusk, enough light to navigate efficiently, enough shadow to mask their approach to the cabin. They resumed their journey, adjusting course based on Luke's continuous assessment of the landscape. The ridge narrowed in places, forcing them to traverse steep slopes covered in loose shale. Luke moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had navigated far worse conditions under fire, demonstrating hand and foot placements for Caleb when necessary. The Hart twins followed their example with professional competence, though Dominique occasionally struggled with the more technical sections. Danielle assisted her sister, instinctively offering a steadying hand or suggesting better footholds, their twin bond manifest in wordless cooperation. By late afternoon, they'd covered nearly 5 miles of challenging terrain, their pace slowed by the need for caution rather than physical limitations. Luke called another brief halt as they reached a small stream cutting across their path, an opportunity to refill water supplies and assess their final approach. Caleb knelt by the water, using a compact filtration system to refill their bottles. The device was military-grade, capable of removing pathogens and contaminants while leaving beneficial minerals intact. Another piece of specialized equipment that had become normal in his young life. As they rested, Dominique approached Luke, her expression grave despite her evident fatigue. "We should discuss contingency plans," she said, keeping her voice low. "If the cabin is compromised, if we're separated." Luke studied her for a moment, recognizing the professional agent beneath the exhaustion and stress. She was thinking ahead, planning for worst-case scenarios, a mindset he respected. "If we're separated, head northwest. There's a state park 20 miles from here, with ranger stations and public access. Establish cover, civilian witnesses, communications." Dominique nodded mentally, filing the information. "And if the cabin is compromised, we don't approach," Luke replied simply. "We observe from distance, identify threats, then extract to alternate location. No heroics, no confrontation unless absolutely necessary." She accepted this with evident relief, perhaps having expected a more aggressive approach from the former Special Forces operative. Her next question was more personal, delivered after a moment's hesitation. "How long have you been preparing Caleb for this kind of situation?" Luke's gaze shifted to his son, who was now showing Danielle how to optimize the water filtration system, his young face animated with the pleasure of sharing knowledge. There was no resentment in his expression, no fear, just focused engagement with the present moment. "Since he was 4. After Sarah died, I knew we'd be vulnerable. Exposed. The people looking for me wouldn't hesitate to use him as leverage." The admission revealed more than Luke typically shared with anyone, but circumstances had created a forced intimacy with the Hart twins. They were bound together now by shared danger, mutual need, and the gradual building of cautious trust. Dominique absorbed this information without judgment, her analytical mind fitting it into the puzzle of Luke and Caleb Walker. The missing wife and mother, the abrupt transition from military service to civilian anonymity, the years spent off the grid, constantly moving, preparing for a threat that had finally materialized in Millstone. "You think whoever's hunting us now is connected to why you disappeared 8 years ago?" Her question was careful, professional, rather than prying. Luke's expression remained unreadable, years of practice controlling his emotional responses even when discussing the most personal topics. "No, different players, different game. But the same principles apply. Powerful interests, compromise agencies, high stakes. I've seen this pattern before." Before Dominique could probe further, Danielle joined them, her expression shifting from the relaxed engagement she'd shown with Caleb to professional focus. "Something's changed in the forest. Birds stopped singing about 30 seconds ago, northwest quadrant." Luke was instantly alert, senses expanding beyond the immediate conversation to the surrounding environment. She was right. The natural symphony of the forest had developed a significant gap in one direction. Not complete silence, which would indicate immediate threat, but a localized disturbance that wildlife had noticed before humans. Could be natural. Bear mountain lion, Dominique suggested, though her posture had already shifted to readiness. Luke shook his head slightly, already calculating. Wrong season, wrong time of day for normal predator movement. His eyes scanned the forest, looking not for obvious threats, but for the subtle signs that indicated human presence. Unnatural gaps in vegetation disturbed ground patterns, the artificial straight lines that didn't occur naturally in wilderness. Caleb had noticed too quietly packing away the filtration system and securing his backpack without being told. The boy moved to his father's side, voice barely above a whisper. Drone would have had time to establish search grid by now, if they deployed ground teams to likely exit points from the road. Luke nodded, completing the tactical assessment in his mind. They'd analyzed the same data he would have: terrain access points, probable movement patterns for subjects abandoning a vehicle. Experienced trackers would eliminate unlikely routes and concentrate resources on high-probability areas. The stream they'd stopped at was an obvious navigation feature. Anyone with wilderness training would follow it for ease of movement and water access. We move now, he decided, already shouldering his pack. Due east off our previous route. They'll expect us to continue along the water. The group responded with immediate compliance, gathering their gear with minimal noise and formation. Luke led them away from the stream at a right angle, pushing through denser underbrush that would normally be avoided by hikers. The thicker vegetation would slow pursuers and obscure their trail advantages that outweighed the additional physical effort required. They moved with heightened urgency but controlled precision, placing feet carefully to minimize noise and disturbance to the forest floor. Luke navigated by the sun's position, maintaining their eastward bearing through increasingly challenging terrain. The land sloped upward, requiring greater exertion as they climbed while pushing through thorny underbrush that tore at clothing and exposed skin. After 20 minutes of sustained effort, they reached another rocky outcropping that offered both cover and visibility. Luke signaled a halt, motioning for everyone to take concealment behind the natural stone formation. They controlled their breathing despite the exertion, minimizing noise, as Luke cautiously peered over the rocks to assess the area they'd vacated. Movement caught his practiced eye. Not the obvious passage of amateur searchers, but the subtle shifts that indicated professionals working a search pattern. 3 figures in nondescript outdoor clothing, moving with the disciplined spacing of tactical operators. They carried themselves with the unmistakable posture of armed individuals, though no weapons were openly visible. Concealed carry maintaining plausible deniability as ordinary hikers if encountered by civilians. Luke withdrew behind the rocks, signaling the others closer to share information without risking voices carrying across the mountainside. 3 operators northwest approach, staggered pattern. Professional, not local law enforcement. His hands formed the shapes and patterns that conveyed tactical information. A silent language Caleb understood perfectly, and the Hart twins recognized from their federal training. Caleb's expression remained calm, despite the danger, his mind working through practical solutions rather than succumbing to fear. He reached into his pack and removed a small device about the size of a smartphone with multiple antennae and a specialized directional microphone. A listening system capable of capturing conversations at significant distances, another piece of equipment that would seem extraordinary for a 12-year-old to possess under normal circumstances. The boy adjusted settings, pointed the device toward the search team, and connected earbuds, which he handed to his father. Luke placed one in his ear, offering the other to Dominique, who accepted it without hesitation. Together, they listened to the search team's communications captured through their operational earpieces and transmitted to Luke and Dominique's improvised surveillance. Nothing at the stream crossing, continuing southwest along the bank. Copy, Team 2 holding position at vehicle site. No additional evidence located. Command confirms primary targets are Walker and Son. Hart subjects secondary priority capture not required. Luke and Dominique exchanged glances, the implications clear. Someone wanted Luke and Caleb specifically with the Hart twins considered collateral. This aligned with the threatening email. The boy disappears next, but added new questions about motivation and identity of the threat actors. Dominique removed the earbud, her expression grim. They know exactly who they're hunting, but if this isn't about our investigation in Millstone, what is it about Luke's mind worked through possibilities, eliminating options systematically? The timing couldn't be coincidence. Their exposure in Millstone had triggered this response, but the specific targeting suggested prior knowledge, prior interest. Someone had recognized Luke Walker and mobilized resources specifically to capture him and Caleb, using the millstone situation as opportunity rather than cause. We need to reach the cabin, he decided. Secure location, resources, communications. Then we figure out who's pulling these strings and why. They adjusted their route again, pushing further east before curving northeast toward their destination. The pursuit had added urgency to their movement, but Luke maintained the disciplined pace that would prevent exhaustion or injury. A twisted ankle or heat exhaustion would compromise them more effectively than any pursuer. The forest grew denser as they ascended, ancient trees blocking more sunlight and creating a perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. The temperature dropped several degrees, bringing welcome relief from exertion, but requiring additional alertness to maintain body heat if they needed to remain stationary for extended periods. Caleb moved alongside his father, now their natural rhythm established through years of wilderness training together. The boy matched Luke's footfalls, placing his feet in the same spots to minimize noise and visible tracks. Despite his youth, he showed no signs of flagging energy or concentration, another result of the intensive preparation Luke had begun when he was barely more than a toddler. The Hart twins maintained pace behind them, their professional conditioning evident in their controlled breathing and steady movement. Danielle occasionally signed observations to Luke, changes in wildlife behavior, potential vantage points, alternative routes. Her tactical awareness confirming Caleb's earlier assessment of her military background. As dusk approached, the forest took on the muted golden quality of fading daylight filtered through leaves. They'd been moving for nearly 6 hours with only minimal breaks, covering difficult terrain at a pace that would have exhausted most civilians. According to Dominique's map, they were now less than a mile from the cabin, close enough to approach with additional caution. Luke signaled another halt, gathering the group in the shelter of a massive fallen oak. We approach the cabin as a reconnaissance first, not a destination. Observe for signs of compromise or surveillance. No one enters until I've cleared it personally. Dominique nodded, fatigue evident in the tightness around her eyes, but determination undiminished. The cabin's security system includes motion sensors on the perimeter and thermal imaging at key approach points. If anyone's been there, we'll have recorded evidence. Assuming they haven't disabled the system, Danielle added pragmatically. Or worse, modified it to alert them to our arrival. Luke acknowledged this concern with a grim nod. Another reason for caution: we'll establish observation points before final approach. If anything feels wrong, anything, we withdraw immediately. As the group prepared to move out for the final leg of their journey, Caleb touched his father's arm. His young face was serious, eyes holding the weight of understanding beyond his years. If they're really after us specifically, not the Hart twins, not the Millstone investigation, then we're putting Dominique and Danielle in danger just by being with them. The observation struck at the core of Luke's growing concern. If his past had somehow resurfaced, he was endangering not just himself but his son, and now these two women who had become entangled in their lives through circumstance rather than choice. Dominique overheard her expression sharpening despite her fatigue. Don't even think about separating Walker. We're in this together now. Her voice left no room for argument, the federal agent's authority momentarily overriding their current fugitive status. Whatever you're running from, whoever is after you, we have resources, training, and connections that you need. And right now, we need you to get us safely to that cabin. After that, we can decide next steps. Luke studied her for a moment, recognizing the steel beneath the professional exterior. The Hart twins had proven themselves capable, resilient, and trustworthy under pressure. And she was right. Alone, his options with Caleb were limited to continued evasion. With federal agents, even compromised ones, came possibilities for resolution rather than perpetual flight. Together then, he agreed, decision made. For now. The final approach to the cabin required all their combined skills and awareness. They moved in diamond formation, Luke on point, Danielle and Dominique on flanks, Caleb protected in the center. Each step was measured, each movement calculated to minimize noise and visibility. As darkness settled fully over the forest, they relied increasingly on other senses. The feel of terrain underfoot, the subtle changes in air current that indicated open spaces ahead, the instinctive awareness of presence that experienced operators developed through years of fieldwork. The cabin materialized gradually from the darkness, not suddenly visible, but slowly resolving from shadow into substance. It was smaller than Luke had expected, given the Hart family wealth, A single-story structure built of weathered logs and stone designed to blend with its surroundings rather than dominate them. Solar panels were visible on the south-facing portion of the roof, and a small satellite dish was mounted discreetly on the north corner. No light showed from within, no smoke from the chimney, no obvious signs of occupation. Luke signaled the group to hold position, while he and Danielle conducted a careful perimeter check, moving in opposite directions to cover the cabin's surroundings. They returned after 15 minutes of methodical assessment, meeting the others at their observation point in the tree line. No obvious surveillance, physical or electronic. Danielle reported, her voice barely above a whisper. No disturbed ground, no concealed observation posts, no vehicle tracks beyond the old ones from seasonal maintenance. Luke nodded agreement with her assessment. The cabin appeared untouched, undisturbed. Either their pursuers hadn't identified it as a potential destination, or they were waiting for the group to reach it before closing their net. Dominique produced a small device from her pack, a security fob that would disarm the cabin's internal systems upon approach. If the codes have been compromised, we'll know immediately. The system sends an authentication challenge before accepting the disarm sequence. Any irregularity triggers a silent alarm to our family's security team. Luke weighed this information against the risks. A connection to outside security meant potential vulnerability, but also potential support if their situation deteriorated further. We approach one at a time, staggered entry. I go first, secure the interior. Caleb follows only after I've confirmed all clear. They move forward with precision, born of training and necessity. Luke approached the cabin from the blind side using natural cover to shield his movement from potential observers. He reached the rough-hewn wooden porch without incident, positioned himself beside the door rather than in front of it, and nodded to Dominique to proceed with the security disarm. She activated the fob, watching the small display for confirmation. 3 seconds passed, each feeling like minutes in the tense silence, before a green light indicated successful authentication. No silent alarms, no security breaches detected. The system accepted her code with normal protocols. Luke entered first, moving through the doorway in the tactical crouch that had been ingrained through years of clearing potentially hostile environments. The cabin's interior was cool and dark, smelling of wood and the lingering hints of a fire long extinguished. He moved methodically through each room: main living area with stone fireplace, small kitchen with propane appliances, 2 bedrooms with simple furnishings, bathroom with surprisingly modern fixtures. No signs of disturbance, no indication that anyone had visited since the cabin was last properly closed. He returned to the doorway and signaled all clear. Caleb entered next, followed by the Hart twins, each moving directly to pre-assigned tasks, securing the perimeter, establishing communications, assessing resources. The practiced efficiency of people accustomed to operating under pressure. Dominique activated the cabin's power systems, bringing low-level lighting online while keeping main fixtures dark to prevent visible signatures from outside. Solar batteries provided limited but sufficient electricity for essential functions. Communication equipment, minimal lighting, refrigeration for perishable supplies. Danielle secured doors and windows, deploying the additional physical barriers beyond the electronic security. Simple wooden bars across door frames, metal pins, and window tracks. Low-tech solutions that couldn't be hacked or disabled remotely. Caleb established his communications and analysis station at the kitchen table, connecting to the cabin's satellite internet through multiple security protocols. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, establishing the digital perimeter that would complement their physical defenses. Luke completed a secondary sweep of the cabin, checking for surveillance devices, hidden compartments, anything that might have been missed in the initial assessment. Finding nothing concerning, he joined the others in the main room, where tension had given way to the focused energy of people with purpose and direction. We should be secure here for at least 48 hours, Dominique stated, checking the cabin supplies. Food, water, medical kit, emergency equipment, all present and in good condition. Basic necessities that would sustain them while they planned next steps. Luke nodded acknowledgement, then turned to Caleb, who was already deep into his digital investigation. The boy looked up, sensing his father's attention. I'm accessing Hart Technologies' secure servers using Dominique's authentication, cross-referencing the offshore account numbers with corporate records, looking for connection points. Danielle joined him at the table, providing additional context for his search. Focus on Project Clearwater, our next-generation filtration system that uses nanomaterials to remove pharmaceutical compounds from municipal water supplies. It's what RiverTech has been trying to steal for the past year. Caleb nodded, adjusting his search parameters accordingly. His young face showed no sign of the exhaustion that should have followed their intensive journey, only the focused concentration of someone in his element doing what he did best. Luke watched his son work, pride tempered by concern. The boy had performed flawlessly throughout the day, physically, mentally, emotionally. But he remained a child thrust into an adult world of danger and deception. A childhood sacrifice for survival justified by necessity, but haunting nonetheless. Dominique approached Luke, keeping her voice low to avoid disturbing Caleb's concentration. Now that we're secure, I think it's time for full disclosure. All cards on the table. Her eyes held no judgment, only professional assessment and cautious trust built through shared danger. Luke met her gaze steadily, weighing options that had defined his existence for 8 years. The habit of secrecy, of compartmentalization, of revealing only what was absolutely necessary. These were survival mechanisms deeply ingrained. But circumstances had changed. The pursuit was specific, targeted. The Hart twins were now irrevocably involved, their lives endangered by association with him and Caleb. He made his decision. Not surrender, but strategic alliance. You're right, it's time you knew exactly who you're dealing with and why someone would deploy professional tactical teams to capture a mechanic and his 12-year-old son. As dusk deepened into full night outside the cabin windows, Luke Walker prepared to share the truth he had buried 8 years ago. The reason he and Caleb lived like ghosts, the secrets that had followed them across state lines and false identities, the past that had finally caught up to them in a small-town bar in Millstone.